IBM System X and BladeCenter servers are some of the most reliable and robust systems within the computer industry. However, the microprocessor sockets of these systems, when exposed during servicing, have extremely delicate, easily damaged socket pins. Hello, I'm Chris Dombrowski from IBM System X Education. In this short educational module, I will demonstrate the proper methods to upgrade and replace microprocessors and system boards that use LAN grid array or LGA sockets, most notably models of the IBM System X3550, X3650, X3850, X3950, BladeCenter HS22, HS22V, HX5, and newer servers. These systems' microprocessor sockets employ small, delicate pins to connect the microprocessor, or CPU, to the system board. When the CPU or proper dust cover is installed in the socket, there is no damage, and the server will operate reliably. However, when handled improperly during CPU servicing or upgrades, these pins are easily bent so they no longer make contact with the installed CPU, causing additional costs, downtime, and lost productivity for the system owner. As a general rule, never expose a CPU socket and its pins. There should always be either a CPU or a dust cover installed in each and every socket in the system. The pins will be exposed for a brief time when you are installing or replacing a CPU or the system board. During servicing or upgrades, adhere to the following 5 guidelines for CPUs and dust covers. 1. Use the removal and insertion tool provided in the CPU option and FRU kits. 2. When removing a CPU or cover, lift vertically up and out of the socket. 3. When installing a CPU or cover, align first, then place gently, vertically down into the socket. 4. Never exert pressure on the socket contents. 5. And most importantly, never touch the socket pins. Do not touch the connectors on the microprocessor and the microprocessor socket. Do not use any tools or sharp objects to lift the release lever on the CPU socket. Improper tools and sharp objects can permanently damage the system board. I will illustrate these guidelines and all of the components using this demonstration socket. When you're inserting or replacing an actual CPU or system board, follow the safety precautions listed in the Problem Determination and Service Guide, or the PDSG, for the system you are servicing. Use static protective surfaces and grounded wrist straps. Static electricity can damage unprotected electronics. First, let me show you how the socket operates. There are 2 movable parts, the locking lever and the retaining cover, or retainer. The locking lever operates by disengaging it from the locking latch and rotating fully about 135 degrees. Once the lever is disengaged, the retainer is lifted upward and rotates open. The socket is now open and fully exposed. To secure the socket, close the retainer and then rotate the lever, carefully fixing the lever under the locking latch. Again, do not use any tools or sharp objects to lift the release lever on the microprocessor socket. Doing so may damage the system board. Next, there are a few removal and insertion tools available from IBM for the CPUs. This tool is designed for use in the X3550, X3650, and HS22, and this tool is designed for IBM's X5 product line. These tools operate by grasping the CPU on 2 opposing edges with 2 small clamps. The clamps are operated by rotating the tool handle between the open and locked positions. Key markings at one corner of the tool align with the key markings on the CPU, and the holes in the tool align with the screws in the socket. There are several different dust cover designs, depending on the age of your system and any previous service actions. You may see 1 or more of these cover types in the system. The most basic cover rests in the socket in the same manner as the CPU. Grasp the opposing edges on the top surface of the cover. Remove or install it by lifting or descending vertically to the socket, as I am doing here. Alternately, the cover attaches to the socket retainer. Slide the cover onto the retainer by aligning the cover slots with the retainer tabs. This design is less prone to damaging the socket pins since your fingers remain farther from the pins than the previous cover design. Regardless, be cautious when working with these dust covers. A third cover design snaps onto the top of the retainer. Align the dust cover extended tab with the base of the retainer when it is in the closed position, and then press the cover down so the opposite edge tabs engage. To remove the cover, fully open the socket retainer and then unsnap the extended tab from the retainer. It is possible to remove this type of cover before you open the socket, but there is a greater chance that you will damage the exposed socket pins as you lift the retainer. So leave the dust cover on until you are prepared to install the CPU. Now that you are familiar with all of the components, let's perform the 3 basic service actions that include the microprocessor: installing a new CPU, replacing an existing CPU, and replacing a system board. To install a new CPU into an unused socket, first, read the instructions and any inserts in the microprocessor option packaging. The instructions and inserts provide up-to-date information on how to properly handle these expensive and delicate components. Carefully remove the microprocessor from the packaging, touching only the edges of the microprocessor. If there is a plastic protective cover on the bottom of the microprocessor, carefully remove it by gently peeling it away from the microprocessor. Put the microprocessor back in the box, connection pad side down, on the solid piece of foam. Twist the handle of the installation tool counterclockwise to open the tool. Place the tool onto the microprocessor and align it using the triangle on the microprocessor and the triangle on the installation tool. Twist the handle of the installation tool clockwise to secure the microprocessor in the tool. Disconnect power to the system, remove the top cover, and then remove any fillers or air guides over the unused socket. Next, rotate the locking lever on the microprocessor socket from its closed and locked position until it stops in the fully open position. Lift the microprocessor retainer cover upward. Remove the dust cover using the appropriate method for the type of cover installed, lifting the cover vertically out of the socket, sliding the cover off of the retainer, or detaching the cover from the retainer. Be careful, the socket pins are now exposed and can be easily damaged if touched. Place the installation tool with the microprocessor down over the open socket and align the holes on the tool with the screws on the microprocessor bracket. The alignment holes on the tool will not sit flush on the microprocessor bracket screws. The holes are a guide to ensure the proper alignment between the installation tool and the microprocessor bracket. Twist the handle counterclockwise to detach the tool from the microprocessor. Carefully lift the tool straight up and away from the socket. Close the retainer and then rotate the lever until it engages under the socket lever latch. Install the proper heatsink for the system you are upgrading. Follow the instructions provided with the heatsink or CPU to properly apply the thermal material between the heatsink and the microprocessor before you attach the heatsink. Do not touch this material. If you do touch it or it otherwise becomes contaminated, the heatsink will need to be replaced. The heatsink is attached either by screws or by a latch and lever system. If it is attached using screws, alternate between the screws as you tighten them, about 2 full turns each. Follow the directions on the heatsink label or on the service label on the system top cover. For systems that use a latch and lever system, rotate the lever to the closed position. Reinstall any air baffles and the top cover. This completes the CPU installation procedure. Now, let's replace an existing CPU. Just like before, read the instructions and any inserts in the new CPU packaging. The instructions and inserts provide up-to-date information on how to properly handle these expensive and delicate components. Disconnect power to the system, remove the top cover, and then remove the CPU's heatsink. The heatsink is attached either by screws or by a latch and lever system. If it is attached using screws, alternate between the screws as you loosen them, about 2 full turns each. Follow the directions on the heatsink label or on the service label on the system top cover. For heat sinks that use a latch and lever system, rotate the lever in the open position and remove the heatsink. Be cautious of the thermal material on the bottom of the heatsink and on top of the CPU. Do not touch this material. If you do touch it or it otherwise becomes contaminated, the heatsink will need to be replaced. Next, rotate the locking lever on the microprocessor socket from its closed and locked position until it stops in the fully open position. Lift the microprocessor retainer cover upward. Find the CPU installation tool that came with the new CPU. Turn the tool handle to the unlocked position. Place the installation tool over the CPU, aligning the holes on the tool with the screws on the microprocessor bracket. The alignment holes on the tool will not sit flush on the microprocessor bracket screws. Use the holes as a guide to ensure proper alignment between the microprocessor installation tool and the microprocessor bracket. Twist the handle clockwise to attach the tool to the CPU. Carefully lift the CPU vertically up and out of the socket and place it on a static protective surface. Be careful! The CPU socket pins are now exposed and can be easily damaged if touched. Twist the handle counterclockwise to detach the tool from the microprocessor. Follow the previous CPU installation procedure to install the replacement CPU. The socket pins will be exposed until you install the new CPU, so do not install or remove any other system components until the new CPU is in place. When the original CPU needs to be returned to IBM, attach the plastic protective cover onto the CPU and place it in the packaging. Retain the CPU installation tool with your system in the event another service action is needed. Finally, let's perform a system board replacement. I will not be going into the specific details about replacing each system board type. I will address the essentials for handling the CPU sockets. The first step of any system board replacement is to look for obvious microprocessor socket damage on the existing system board as well as the replacement system board. If you are an IBM service representative and you determine that during the replacement procedure that there is damage unrelated to the existing system board's manufacturing, escalate this potential billable situation per the geography processes and bill the client for the service action, if applicable. If you discover damage on the replacement through system board, escalate to your front office part support with the 11S barcode label for tracking and isolation. The details of system board replacement are in the respective PDSG for the system. If you are not familiar with the procedures, download and read the PDSG before continuing. Disconnect power to the system, remove the top cover, and remove all FRUs, CRUs, and option adapters required to access the system board, such as air baffles, memory, HBA adapters, riser cards, fans, fan cages, and the microprocessor heatsinks. Unscrew the system board from the chassis and remove the system board. Before you install the replacement board into the chassis, install the microprocessors from the existing board. Follow the CPU removal and installation procedures at the beginning of this video to move each CPU from the old board to the replacement board. As CPUs are installed on the replacement board, install the dust covers you have removed onto the sockets of the old board, so there will be no damage to the sockets during shipping. Once all the CPUs are installed on the replacement board, ensure all sockets without a CPU have a dust cover. Follow the procedures in the system's PDSG and install the system board into the chassis, and install all FRUs, CRUs, and options. This completes microprocessor LGA socket handling procedure education for IBM System X and BladeCenter systems. Performing these tasks properly will eliminate any chance of socket damage.